My husband and I were in the midst of a divorce, a heartbreaking end to what had once been a hopeful union. Our journey together, which spanned 15 years of marriage, had been marked by a deep, shared desire to have children. From the moment we said our vows, we dreamed of building a family together. We talked endlessly about what it would be like to have children running through the house, filling our lives with laughter and love. But despite our best efforts and years of fertility treatments, that dream never came true. The strain of our inability to conceive began to wear on both of us. Every failed treatment brought with it a wave of disappointment and sadness, and slowly, those feelings began to erode the bond we once shared. I noticed a change in my husband. He became more withdrawn, less interested in the life we had built together. While I continued to hold out hope that we might still find a way to become parents, he seemed to have given up on that dream. Our conversations about children, once filled with excitement and anticipation, became strained. He no longer wanted to talk about the possibility of having kids, and eventually, the topic became almost taboo. As the months went by, the distance between us grew. My husband started coming home later and later from work, sometimes not returning until the early hours of the morning, and on some nights, he didn't come home at all. It wasn't long before we were sleeping in separate bedrooms, each of us retreating into our own world of sadness and disappointment. The life we had imagined for ourselves was slipping away, and neither of us seemed to have the strength or the will to hold it together. The decision to divorce was not made lightly, but it had become clear that our marriage could no longer be salvaged. I took the painful step of preparing the divorce papers, knowing that it was the only way for us to move forward. As I packed up my belongings, getting ready to leave the home we had shared for so many years, I couldn't help but reflect on the love and the dreams that had once brought us together. It was difficult to accept that those dreams were now lost forever. Before leaving, I decided that we should have one last meal together, a final attempt to part ways on somewhat amicable terms. I made reservations at a high-end sushi restaurant, hoping that we could at least share a quiet, civil dinner before going our separate ways. My husband was supposed to come straight to the restaurant after work, and although I had my doubts about whether he would actually show up, I clung to the hope that he might. I arrived at the restaurant on time, but as I waited, there was no sign of my husband. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that he was probably just running late. Maybe work had held him up. But as the minutes ticked by and the empty seat across from me remained vacant, I began to worry. I sent him a text message, hoping for a quick response, but there was none. I tried calling him, but the line was disconnected. It wasn't like him to be completely unreachable, and a sense of dread started to creep in. Sitting there alone in the bustling restaurant, I realized that I might be eating my last meal as his wife by myself. With a heavy heart, I decided to go ahead and order dinner, trying to make the best of a difficult situation. As I quietly picked at my food, lost in thought, I became aware of a middle-aged couple seated at the table next to mine. They had been glancing over at me, and eventually, the woman leaned over and spoke to me. "Forgive me if I'm wrong," she said cautiously, "but are you by any chance Daniel's wife?" Her question took me by surprise. I hadn't expected anyone to recognize me, especially not in this setting. "Yes, I am," I replied, nodding. I was curious as to how they knew my husband. Were they old friends of his? Perhaps business acquaintances? The husband of the couple, who introduced himself as Henry, spoke next. "We thought it was you. Daniel showed us a picture of you once, and when we saw you here, we felt we had to talk to you." Confusion and curiosity swirled in my mind. "May I ask what your relationship with my husband is?" I inquired, trying to piece together how these strangers knew so much about us. Henry's face softened, and he leaned in slightly as he began to speak. "Daniel saved our lives." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I felt a jolt of surprise and disbelief. "What do you mean?" I asked, needing to understand. Henry took a deep breath and began to tell me their story. He and his wife had been through an incredibly difficult time, and their situation had become so dire that they had nearly lost all hope. Henry had been working as a temporary laborer at a factory, barely making ends meet. But when the company's business took a downturn, he lost his job. With his wife suffering from a chronic illness that left her unable to work, they quickly found themselves drowning in debt. Their savings were depleted, and no matter how hard Henry tried, he couldn't find another job. Despite his experience, his age worked against him, and every application he submitted was rejected before he even got an interview. As the bills piled up and his wife's health continued to decline, Henry and his wife found themselves in a state of utter despair. They were trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. 5 years ago, they reached a point where they saw no other option but to end their lives. They made a plan to do it together, believing that death was their only way out. They went to a Home Depot, purchased charcoal briquettes and duct tape, and prepared to seal their apartment's windows, intending to take their own lives. But before carrying out their plan, they decided to have one last meal together at a hamburger chain restaurant. It was a final, small comfort before they ended it all. After they finished eating and left the restaurant, something unexpected happened. They encountered my husband, Daniel. "Excuse me, do you have a minute?" Daniel's voice was hesitant but carried an urgency that made Henry and his wife stop in their tracks. They turned to face him, a man they had never met before, with a warm yet troubled expression on his face. "How about a drink?" "It's on me," Daniel offered, mimicking the action of drinking with his hand as if to make his intentions clearer. The gesture, though simple, struck a chord with them. They could tell there was something more behind his invitation, something that prompted Henry to nod in agreement. Henry and his wife exchanged quick, uncertain glances, silently questioning each other about what was happening. They couldn't understand why this stranger had approached them or what he could want, but there was a familiarity in his eyes that suggested he had overheard something significant. As they followed Daniel down the street, Henry's mind wandered back to a conversation he had recently with his wife, a conversation filled with desperation. They had once said, almost in passing, that they would accept anything, as long as they could have one last drink, a small solace in a world that had become increasingly cold and unkind. And now, here was a man, seemingly appearing out of nowhere, offering them exactly that. Daniel led them to a nearby convenience store, its bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the fading evening light outside. The store was quiet, almost deserted, which added to the surreal feeling of the moment. Daniel didn't hesitate as he walked straight to the refrigerated section, grabbing 3 cans of beer with a practiced ease. There was something ritualistic about the way he picked them up, as though this was something he had done many times before, for reasons known only to him. After paying for the beers, Daniel motioned for them to follow him once again. They walked in silence, the sounds of the city fading as they entered a small, nearby park. The park was modest, just a few scattered benches and a patch of green surrounded by trees. It was the kind of place that one might pass by without a second thought, yet in that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. Daniel chose a bench that was slightly worn, its wooden slats softened by time and weather. He sat down heavily, as if the weight of his thoughts had been pressing on him all day. With a quiet sigh, he handed a can of beer to Henry and his wife, keeping the last one for himself. He cracked open his can, the sharp sound of the tab breaking through the silence. He took a long, deliberate drink, the liquid sliding down his throat with a sense of finality, as if he was steeling himself for what was to come. "Please, have a drink," Daniel said softly, his voice almost pleading. It wasn't just an offer, it was a request, a bridge he was trying to build between them, a connection he desperately needed. Henry, feeling the gravity of the moment, followed suit. He opened his can of beer, the cold metal of the can feeling strangely comforting in his hand. As he took a sip, he noticed the way Daniel watched them, his gaze steady but filled with unspoken emotions. They drank in silence for a few moments, the quiet of the park wrapping around them like a blanket. Then, almost as if unable to hold it in any longer, Daniel spoke, his voice low and tinged with sadness. "You should forget about it," he began, his words hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. Henry looked at him, confused, not understanding what he meant. But before he could ask, Daniel continued, his eyes focused on some distant point in the park. "I was sitting next to you at the hamburger store earlier today. I overheard your conversation." He paused, as if searching for the right words to explain himself. "I know it's none of my business, but I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't ignore what I heard." Henry and his wife exchanged a look, a mixture of surprise and vulnerability crossing their faces. They hadn't realized that anyone had been listening, that their private despair had been laid bare for a stranger to hear. Yet, here was Daniel, someone who had not only listened but felt compelled to act. Daniel's voice softened further, almost breaking as he spoke. "If you stay alive, something good will happen to you at some point. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. Even welfare exists, you can depend on the government. There's nothing wrong with that. We've all been paying high taxes for moments like this, for when we need help the most." He looked directly at Henry now, his eyes pleading with him to understand. "At the very least, if you're alive, things will work out. Don't you want to drink beer like this again? Don't you want to experience these small moments, even when everything else seems to be falling apart? I'm sorry if I'm overstepping, but after hearing your story, I couldn't just stand by." As Daniel spoke, Henry felt a stirring of something inside him, a faint glimmer of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the warmth of a shared moment. There was something about Daniel, something in his demeanor, that spoke of a deep kindness and an unwavering belief in doing what was right. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were steady as he swiped through his photos, finally stopping on one. "This is my wife," he said, turning the phone so that Henry and his wife could see. The picture showed a woman with a radiant smile, her eyes sparkling with happiness. It was clear that she was the center of Daniel's world, the person he cherished above all else. I love her more than anything, Daniel continued, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. I've worked so hard to make her happy, to give her everything she ever wanted. But there's one thing I can't give her, children. Henry and his wife listened intently, their own troubles momentarily set aside as they focused on Daniel's story. There was a rawness to his words, a vulnerability that made them lean in closer. We've been married for over 10 years, Daniel said, his eyes filling with tears. And we still can't have children. We've tried everything, and when we went to the hospital for tests, we found out it was my fault. I'm the reason we can't have a family. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before continuing. My wife has always wanted children. It's something she's dreamed of since the day we got married. And I can't give her that. I see the pain in her eyes every time we talk about it, every time she holds a friend's baby. She tries to hide it, but I know it's there. Daniel's tears began to flow freely now, his composure crumbling as he spoke. I keep thinking that maybe she would be happier with someone else, someone who can give her the children she deserves. But I don't want to leave her. I can't imagine my life without her. What should I do? How can I make her happy when I'm the one who's causing her so much pain? Henry felt a deep empathy for Daniel, understanding all too well the anguish of feeling inadequate, of wanting to give your partner everything and falling short. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder, squeezing it gently. You know, Daniel, Henry began, his voice soft yet filled with conviction, a couple can be happy without children. My wife and I, we didn't have any children either. It wasn't by choice, but we made the best of what we had. We were poor, struggling to make ends meet, but we found happiness in each other. We cherished the time we had together, even when things were tough. As Henry spoke, he could see the impact his words were having on Daniel. The younger man's face softened, the tightness in his expression easing as he listened. Henry continued, his voice growing more confident, happiness isn't just about children or material things. It's about the love you share, the connection you have with your spouse. My wife and I may not have had much, but we were happy because we had each other. Henry paused, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the reflection of his own life in Daniel's eyes, the struggles, the joys, the quiet moments of contentment that made everything else bearable. Please, don't give up on your marriage, Henry urged. Your wife loves you, and that's the most important thing. Find happiness in the life you have together, even if it's not exactly what you envisioned. As he spoke, memories of his own life with his wife flooded his mind, those early years when they had struggled to make ends meet, when they had nothing but each other, and how that had been enough. He realized now, more than ever, that those years had been some of the happiest of his life. Moved by Henry's words, Daniel wiped away his tears, nodding slowly as if finally understanding what he needed to do. The burden on his shoulders seemed to lighten, the darkness in his heart lifting just a little. Henry's wife, who had been quietly listening, now spoke up, her voice gentle and reassuring. Daniel, we were in a similar situation once. We were at our lowest, unsure of how we would get through another day. But your husband, he helped us when we needed it most. He showed us kindness when we felt like giving up. And because of him, we found the strength to carry on. Her words were filled with gratitude, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We managed to find a job, even though it was in an industry we knew nothing about. The park seemed different in the deepening twilight, bathed in the cool, silver light of the full moon. The familiar sights of swaying trees, the distant murmur of the sea, and the gentle hum of crickets felt almost surreal, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The gravel beneath my feet crunched softly with each step, echoing in the otherwise silent night. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless rhythm of anxiety and hope, mingling with the memories that flooded back with every familiar sight. I knew this place so well. It was here that we had spent countless evenings, laughing, talking, and dreaming about our future. It was under these very stars that he had knelt down on one knee and asked me to be his wife, his voice trembling with excitement and love. But now, the park seemed almost haunted by the ghosts of our past happiness, the echoes of our laughter drowned out by the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. As I rounded the corner, I saw him. Al sat alone on a weathered bench, the wood worn smooth by the passage of time and the countless people who had rested there. His figure was slumped, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if the weight of the world was pressing down on them. The street lamp above cast a soft, golden halo around him, but it did nothing to warm the cold, desolate aura that surrounded him. In one hand, he clutched a half-empty can of beer, the other hand covering his face, hiding the tears that I knew were falling. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, my heart breaking at the sight of him. He looked so lost, so utterly defeated, and it took every ounce of strength I had to keep the tears from spilling over. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to go to him. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I slowly approached, my steps cautious, as if I was afraid that any sudden movement would shatter the fragile peace that seemed to hang in the air. "I finally found you," I said softly, my voice trembling with a mixture of relief, sadness, and love. He didn't react at first, as if he hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, he lowered his hand and looked up. His face was a mess of emotions, his eyes red and swollen from crying, his cheeks glistening with fresh tears. He stared at me, his expression one of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that I was really there. Then, with a weak, almost forced smile, he whispered, "I guess you did." There was a painful silence between us, filled only by the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. This was the place where our journey had begun, where he had made that unforgettable promise to love me forever. But now, as I looked at him, I couldn't help but wonder if that promise still held any meaning for him, or for me. "Why did you come here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to sound strong, but I couldn't keep the tremor out of my voice. I needed to know, why had he come back to this place that held so many memories of what we once were? He looked away, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the sea met the sky, the moonlight shimmering on the dark waters. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort, and then, in a voice that was barely audible, he said, "I'm sorry. I just couldn't go through with it. I couldn't face you, because I knew that if I did, it would be the end of everything. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." His voice broke on the last word, and I saw the tears well up in his eyes again, spilling over and running down his cheeks. He quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand, but it was no use. The tears kept coming, as if he had been holding them back for so long and now they were finally free. "I didn't reply to your messages. I didn't answer your calls, because I was terrified," he continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I thought that if I ignored it, if I pretended it wasn't happening, maybe it wouldn't be real. Maybe we wouldn't have to face the end." Each word he spoke was like a dagger to my heart, cutting deeper and deeper. I could feel the pain in his voice, the raw, unfiltered anguish that he had been hiding from me. And it broke me to see him like this, to see the man I loved so deeply, so utterly consumed by fear and guilt. Tears blurred my vision as I watched him, my heart aching for him, for us, for everything we had lost. Slowly, I stepped closer, until I was standing right in front of him. Without saying a word, I reached out and gently took the can of beer from his hand, setting it aside on the ground. Then, I knelt down in front of him, so that we were eye to eye. "I really don't want to lose you," he choked out, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for being so selfish. For putting you through all of this. But I thought you'd be better off without me." His words shattered whatever resolve I had left. I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They spilled over, running down my cheeks as I reached out and took his hands in mine. "That's not true," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You're wrong, Al. I don't want to lose you either. I need you. I love you." He looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Then, slowly, his face crumpled, and a sob escaped his lips. "But, I thought you were going to leave me," he stammered, his voice shaking with fear. "I thought, because of the children." I took a deep, shuddering breath, knowing that this was the moment I had been dreading, the moment I had to tell him the truth. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice trembling. "But I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. I could see the worry etched in every line of his face, the way his hands trembled in mine. But I had to do this, I had to be honest with him. "I read your diary," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but I was so lost, Al. I was so confused and hurt, and I didn't know what else to do. So, I read it, and that's when I found out, about everything." His face went pale, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull away. But I held onto his hands, refusing to let him go. "I know I shouldn't have," I continued, my voice trembling with guilt. "But I needed to understand. And then I met Henry and his wife at the sushi place. They told me everything, Al. They told me about your struggle, about how you found out you couldn't have children. But that's not why I wanted a divorce, Al. I wasn't trying to leave you because we couldn't have kids. I was afraid that you didn't love me anymore. That you didn't want me." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, sadness, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked at me, as if trying to process what I had just said. Then, finally, something in his eyes softened, and he reached out to gently cup my face in his hands. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for making you feel that way. I've avoided you, pushed you away, because I was scared. Scared that if we talked about it, if we faced it, it would hurt you even more. I thought I was protecting you. But all I did was push you away. And for that, I'm so sorry. His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing over me with an intensity that took my breath away. I could feel the sincerity in every word, the deep, abiding love that still existed between us, even after everything we had been through. And in that moment, I knew with every fiber of my being, that we could find our way back to each other. That our love was strong enough to overcome even this. I love you, he continued, his voice trembling with emotion. I've always loved you, and I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away, by not talking about it. But I see now. I see that I was wrong. I don't want a divorce, Al. I don't want to lose you. I need you, more than anything. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to him, my heart breaking and healing all at once. I could feel the love, the desperation, the hope in his voice, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, I reached up and placed my